Hollywood's relationship to propaganda movies and even to the word propaganda changed really overnight after Pearl Harbor. There was a window, not a very long window, but several months, which was long enough for dozens of movies to go into production and hundreds of movies to go into development, when after Pearl Harbor, the word propaganda was no longer a dirty word, and it was used openly. Some people in Hollywood preferred to call them morale movies rather than propaganda movies. But the idea behind them, which was that Hollywood was going to help in the war effort and was going to produce entertainment movies that contained any one of about half a dozen different messages that the Office of War Information and its Hollywood subsidiary, the Bureau of Motion Pictures, wanted in the movie, was openly expressed. After Pearl Harbor, the definition of propaganda changed. What were you propagandizing for, if not American intervention? We were in the war now. There was propaganda about preparedness. There was propaganda about how great it was to be in the army. There was propaganda about what the Germans were doing and why it was so terrible, and also about what the Japanese were doing. There was propaganda about democracy and American values. There was propaganda about America's might. There was propaganda about America's factories. There was propaganda intended to suggest the great American value of sacrifice in the war effort. You know, one of the really important messages was about what you would have to give up, what luxuries you would have to do without, what conveniences you would have to put away. The whole West Coast lived under blackouts for quite a while. When we talk about the U.S. government urging Hollywood to put propaganda messages in its movies, which is, by the way, something that was never mandated. This was never a law or an order. Still, we automatically think there's something insidious about this. There's something really bad about it. And of course, there is. We don't want to live in a system or under a system where the entertainment that's being purveyed to us is being kind of vetted and re-scripted in any way by the US government. But I think one thing that gets lost in it is that compared to Hollywood, there were times when the government was actually a progressive force. It was the Bureau of Motion Pictures, which was an arm of a government agency, that really fought hard, for instance, against overt anti-Asian stereotyping in Hollywood movies. Now, part of that was self-interest. The government felt that Hirohito would survive the war and that the U.S. would eventually have to forge a relationship, a rebuilt relationship with him. But part of it was honestly intended. You know, there was a feeling that fomenting American racism by suggesting, as some Hollywood movies did, that every Japanese American was a potential double agent or spy or traitor was really dangerous. Dangerous to American values and dangerous to the safety of Japanese citizens. One reason the government was doing that was because all of the Japanese Americans it was keeping in internment camps were, under this plan, to be dispersed to different towns and cities across the country so that they would not be dangerously concentrated. And the government feared that all of these anti-Japanese caricatures in Hollywood movies would make small towns less willing to house them. So nobody's motives in this were good. And although there were a lot of great movies during the 1940s, and there were a lot of great movies with pro-war messages, the best of those movies were made without Washington's intervention, and the best of those movies, with some major exceptions, were made not from a pure impulse to propagandize, but from some creative impulses as well. I think there are absolutely exceptions. You can argue that The Best Years of Our Lives is a propaganda movie. It's also indisputably a great movie. It's, in a way, the signal of the shift from propaganda movies to message movies. two movies that flourished right after World War II that were intended to address a set of social problems and advocate for a solution to them. Foreign Correspondent did not begin as a World War II or propaganda film, even to the extent that it eventually became one, because its origins go all the way back to 1936. Walter Wanger, who was an American producer and very politically active and interventionist. In 1936, he came upon a book called Personal History and wanted to make a movie of it. But it took several years and several shiftings of the political wind for Wanger to get it to a place where it became a script for Foreign Correspondent. Walter Wanger was always trying to make his films more topical, more current, and more political, more overtly political than Hollywood was comfortable with and than Hollywood would allow. The government's relationship to Hollywood in terms of urging them to make movies with war content, urging them to make pro-war movies, did not start in earnest until after Pearl Harbor. In 1939 and 40 and 41, the isolationist wing of Congress was maybe not a majority, but very loud and very strong. And Hollywood, which was viewed by them as this place of moral licentiousness run by corrupt first or second generation Jews. And that was a really important factor because isolationism and anti-Semitism often went hand in hand in Congress and out of Congress. That made it a lot harder for the government to intervene and say, please start putting pro-war messages in your movies. And it made Hollywood very cautious about doing anything that was too explicitly a call to arms. Walter Wanger, as a producer, was absolutely at the outer limits of pushing to see what you could get away with in terms of pro-war and pro-interventionist content. It helped that he worked for United Artists because United Artists didn't function the way other studios did. We think of it as a studio name, but in fact, United Artists was more of a proto-indie. It was a home for very powerful independent producers, whether they were Hal Roach or Charlie Chaplin, one of the founders of United Artists, or Alexander Korda, or Wanger, to make their movies. And compared to, say, MGM or Paramount or Warner Brothers, where the head of the studio's word was law, United Artists was more laissez-faire. So Wanger could get away with more at UA. Personal History lay dormant for a while. Wanger didn't give it up entirely, but it went on the back burner. And then after Germany's invasion of Poland, he got interested again. He hired two writers who had worked for the March of Time, the newsreel series. And this was, again, Wanger tugging his movie ever more in the direction of news and topicality. He was interested in hiring Charles Boyer and Claudette Colbert. Colbert actually ended up starring instead in a very similar movie for Paramount called Arise My Love that was also released in 1940 and shares with Foreign Correspondent a plot that was very, very common between 1939 and Pearl Harbor, which was the protagonist is a sort of cynical or disinterested or disengaged American. And the dramatic arc of the movie is his awakening, his realizing that he can no longer afford to sit back and watch the news unfold, that he has to take a stand. American studios and producers really wanted to send a message that isolationism and neutrality were dead ends. And they would often do it through protagonists like Joel McCrea in Foreign Correspondent or like Ray Milland, his equivalent, who's also a reporter in Arise My Love. In 1940, Hitchcock was beginning the American phase of his movie career. He had made Rebecca, which made a huge splash here for David Selznick, and The Lady Vanishes had been very popular. You know, 1940 was a very fraught moment in the history of the war. Obviously, England was in it and had been since September 1939, but was about to get really in it. What was called the Phony War was coming to an end. And, you know, now to be a filmmaker in England was to be in real danger. And many British filmmakers who had stayed after the official declaration of war in September 1939 were now leaving or were being forced to leave. Alexander Korda famously had to shut down production on The Thief of Baghdad and come to the United States and finish it here. And there was the sort of inverse pressure on Hollywood's large British emigre community to drop what they were doing and go back to England and sign up to make either dramatic, patriotic films or propaganda or documentaries for the Ministry of Information. Michael Balcon, who was a major British film figure and producer and had really been Hitchcock's mentor, went after him very directly for his refusal to come back to England once the war there started. And he said that he really disdained British filmmakers, and this is a quote, who prefer to remain in Hollywood instead of returning home to aid their country's war efforts. He, meaning Hitchcock, is one of our most famous directors, and he is in Hollywood while we who are left behind short-handed are trying to harness the films to our great national effort. So this was not calling Hitchcock a deserter, but it was perilously close. And Hitchcock was really hurt and offended and affronted by this. I think what's not fair about it is the implicit suggestion that he was indifferent to what was happening in England and uninterested in making any movies or doing anything to help the war effort. That was manifestly untrue. And I think evidence of the fact that Hitchcock was absolutely proud of his British identity, was deeply concerned by what was happening in the war, and wanted to do his part to help, was the two short films he made a few years later in 1944 for the Ministry of Information, Bon Voyage and Aventure Malgache. So Walter Wanger in 1939 succeeded in getting David O. Selznick to loan him Hitchcock. That was a big get. Hitchcock was not particularly interested in turning Foreign Correspondent into a thinly disguised newsreel. When Hitchcock came in, his writing team started to work on the movie. These were maybe the sixth or seventh or eighth writers: Joan Harrison, Alma Reville, Hitchcock's wife, Charles Bennett. So there were many, many, many sets of fingerprints on Foreign Correspondent, but the most significant ones were Hitchcock's team. They turned it into a Hitchcock movie, a light, adventure-driven drama about a spy and a reporter and a girl with very episodic plot beats. One thing that the production code and Joseph Breen was still insisting on in 1940 was that Germany not be explicitly identified as the target of the enmity and scorn of whatever characters were expressing it in the film. This was an absurd thing because anybody who saw these movies knew what was going on, whether it was called Barovia or some made-up country, or whether Germany was never explicitly identified, but Hitler was named, or whether you could make everything look German, but nobody could speak German. So the famous and probably apocryphal story about this is that Ben Hecht and Hitchcock had everybody who spoke German in the movie speak it backwards, so that they were actually sort of speaking a nonsense language. Foreign Correspondent is a really interesting example of both the silliness of this problem, because Germany is not named, Hitler is named, and the ease with which intelligent filmmakers, directors, and producers got around it. Because there's absolutely no missing what is going on, and when we look back at the movie with our full knowledge of the war, It's kind of an interesting point of trivia that Germany isn't named, but I think you almost would not notice that it isn't named because it so obviously is about what it's about that you're not listening for the name. I think what happened during the shoot was that the movie started to get tugged bit by bit and news event by news event a little bit back from Hitchcock's version toward Wanger's because it was shooting in April and May of 1940, and that's when Denmark fell. That's when Norway fell. Every single time something happened, Wanger wanted something new threaded into the script or threaded into the parts of the script that had not already been shot yet. And that didn't mean a wholesale rewrite. Sometimes it meant a line or a gesture. This was also a really tricky thing to do because as it was written, Foreign Correspondent ended on September 3rd, 1939, which is when the war started. So the tension was between Wanger, who wanted to keep the movie as up-to-date as possible, and Hitchcock, who wanted to make the movie he wanted to make. And this tension during pre-production was happening at a moment when almost every week in February and March of 1940 brought new news about what Hitler was doing. So Wanger won, basically, because news was on his side. Hitchcock won in that he brought his own writers onto the movie, and what they did was write him a Hitchcock movie. But throughout Foreign Correspondent, information about what is happening in the world is sewn in.
I say, did you hear the wireless?
War declared! Read all about it! Special war! War declared! War! It's war with Germany! War declared!
And the most important change that was made in Foreign Correspondent was not made during the shoot, it was made after the shoot.
We have as a guest tonight one of the soldiers of the press, one of the little army of historians who are writing history from beside the cannon's mouth.
When Ben Hecht was brought in to write this famous last scene. And I think one interesting thing about Foreign Correspondent is it's not seamless. The war stuff, the news stuff, the newsreel tone of certain moments, and that stentorian call to arms and to action that Joel McCrea delivers in the last scene, they're not seamlessly woven into the movie, especially the last scene is completely glued on. But because the Hitchcockian part of Foreign Correspondent is also sort of patchy and larky, and it's not seamless, it kind of doesn't matter that it's not this perfectly shaped thing. Foreign Correspondent takes place, even though it's very lighthearted and exciting, in a recognizable contemporary world. In a way, Wanger did himself and Hitchcock and the movie a huge favor by insisting that there be enough traction with the real world in the rest of the movie so that the last scene, the last monologue, is not a shock.
What's your opinion of the present European crisis, Mr. Jones?
What crisis?
I'm referring to the impending war, Mr. Jones.
Oh, that?
Yeah.
Well, to tell you the truth, Mr. Powers, I haven't given it much thought.
You know, because the Joel McCrea character is set up so explicitly as a sort of passive, disinterested observer, the last scene makes characterological sense as the end of his arc.
How about it, Carol?
They're listening in America, Johnny.
Okay, we'll tell them.
Mr. Fisher, Mr. Jones, our new foreign correspondent. I want you to know each other.
How do you do, Mr. Jones?
Jones, I don't like that name. It's going to handicap you, young man.
I mean, his name is Johnny Jones. It was like naming a character America, America. He is announced as a stand-in for Middle American values and for the place that Middle American values was not understanding about the war. I mean, Little Johnny Jones is the musical in 1904 that introduced Yankee Doodle Dandy. It's like the most patriotic name you could give a character. And so his lack of real understanding about what's going on, but his curiosity to know more as a reporter, those are presented early in the movie as very emblematically American virtues. And his arc toward understanding is what we follow. cast and crew of Foreign Correspondent was a blend that really reflected some of the churn and turmoil of what was going on in the world at the time. Walter Wanger was American. Joel McCrea, the star, was American. Hitchcock, obviously, was British. Albert Basserman, who plays Van Meer, was a German emigre who had to leave his country many years earlier in 1933 because his wife was Jewish. George Sanders was British, but was about to make his name in Hollywood by playing villains and often played Nazis. So the amalgam of people who made Foreign Correspondent were a really interesting cross-section of Americans, Brits, emigres, people who had not really been touched by what was going on in Germany yet, and people whose lives were turned upside down by what was going on in Germany.
I suppose you guessed I'm a foreign correspondent.
Are you? That's nice.
I see you're taking notes. Are you covering this affair, too?
Well, I sort of work here.
Oh, publicity. Well, you're just the one I'm looking for. We've got to go in a secret conference right away.
You know, a lot of people think that Foreign Correspondent is one apolitical movie, and then at the end, Joel McCrea delivers this radio address as the bombs fall, and that's its political gesture. That's really not true. There's a lot of politics throughout this movie, including in the plane crash sequence.
I'm not going to put this on.
Where this woman, indignant, angry British woman, says, you know, I've never heard of anything so stupid, and she is shot dead on the spot by a bullet that flies through the plane window. The war literally barges into the frame of the movie.
What are they firing at? I never heard of anything so stupid. I shall see the British consul as soon as I...
That's a moment where Hitchcock's absolutely wicked sense of humor and Wanger's sense of loudly expressed politics merge perfectly, because that woman is the stand-in for people on either side of the Atlantic who in 1940 were clinging to this deluded belief that the war was much ado about nothing.
I've just found out you're a newspaper man.
I guess that's right.
Oh, it is, huh? Why didn't you tell me that when I questioned you? You lied to me, sir.
My dear Captain, when you've been shot down in a British plane by a German destroyer 300 miles off the coast of England...
I think Hitchcock, throughout the movie, keeps it both a Hitchcock movie and a contemporary news movie. The whole way that Johnny is used, his is an arc of awakening, and also, you know, this is maybe stretching it a little bit, but if we look at the movie's most famous sequence, the assassination on the steps, where everyone is hidden under umbrellas, and Joel McCrea is dashing to try to find out what's happened, he's the only one who is exposed. So there's a great kind of thematic elegance to that scene. It's not just a clever, like, oh, what a smart use of umbrellas. Everybody is under an umbrella in that sequence. The sequence is about the assassination of an important figure, or is it about the assassination of an important figure's double? Nobody's identity is clear. Everyone has a shield. That's the first moment at which the Joel McCrea character, who also has a shield in that he has an alias, exposes himself. And the movie is in some ways about saying who you are. I'm an American, this is where I stand, this is what I believe in. So even in his most famous visual set piece, there's a consistency with the political message of the movie that I think is more elegant than sometimes Foreign Correspondent's detractors give it credit for being. I don't think that I would call Foreign Correspondent an outright propaganda film. The Last Scene is a propaganda movie. The movie, I think, is not, although its message of moving from neutrality or isolationism to intervention and from disengagement to engagement was very, very on point for 1940. Even more than Lifeboat, and certainly more than anything else in Hitchcock's filmography. And I think Foreign Correspondent is, thanks in part to Wanger, but also in part to Hitchcock, the closest thing he ever made to a message movie.